Alright, this video we're going to be looking at self-report techniques, and this is an example of a non-experimental technique. So we've looked at experiments in psychological research in detail, and now these are a technique that don't require the use of experiments. So in this video we're going to be focusing on questionnaires, but another example of a self-report technique is an interview. So self-report is basically where we've got our participants, or in this case our respondents, disclosing information about their thoughts and feelings and attitudes, rather than this being discovered through observation or experimentation and data gathered from a dependent variable. So questionnaires can be done obviously on paper or online, and they're probably the most common form of self-report technique. Unsurprisingly, they consist of a preset list of written questions to which a participant responds. They're used to assess thoughts and feelings and attitudes, and they can be used to assess the dependent variable of an experiment. So, for example, we could use a questionnaire in a quasi-study where we're wanting to compare the attitudes, for example, of men and women on a new recycling campaign, or about their exercise habits, for example. Or perhaps we want to compare the attitudes of older participants and younger participants on changing legislation and legalizing recreational drugs, for example. So we can develop questionnaires just to assess people's thoughts and feelings about a particular subject, or we could use it as a way of measuring the dependent variable in a quasi-study. So different types of questions, we can have a number of different styles of questions in a questionnaire. These can be sort of broadly divided into open and closed questions. And most questionnaires are going to use a combination of each, as they both come with their own strengths and limitations. So an open question is a question for which there is no fixed choice of response. So respondents are free to answer in any way that they wish. So for example, why did you take up smoking? You're going to get a whole range of different responses, and this is likely to be unique for each respondent. These generally produce qualitative data, and as we know, this is non-numerical data. So this is going to be data that is gathered in the form of words. We can also have closed questions in a questionnaire, so this is where there is a fixed choice of responses, and this is going to be usually determined in advance by the person who has created the questionnaire. So, for example, how many hours do you spend on social media? Circle 1. How social are you? Please circle. And do you study psychology? Yes or no. Now, note, this one here is going to produce qualitative data, yes or no. But this can easily be then changed into quantitative data by counting the frequency of people who say yes and the frequency of people who say no. Generally, though, particularly in the example of scales like this, we're producing quantitative data. And so the strengths and limitations of qualitative and quantitative data apply here. Closed questions can be further divided into different types. When we're talking about scales, like the ones on this slide, we typically refer to these as items rather than questionnaires, because they're not strictly questions in the traditional sense. So we've got 3 different types of scales. We've got Likert scales. So Likert scales, respondents indicate their agreement or otherwise with a statement, like, do you agree or disagree with the following statement? There were enough toppings on my pizza, using a scale of usually 5 points, ranging from strongly agree to strongly disagree. We usually have 5 because we want some sort of neutral position in the middle, so that we're not forcing participants into one stance or another. We can also have rating scales, which work in a really similar way, but instead of having the scale from strongly agree to strongly disagree, respondents identify a value that represents the strength or their feeling about a particular topic. So here we've got 0 representing not likely at all, and 10 being extremely likely. And it's really important that we've got these labels at either end of our rating scale so participants know what a 0 means and what a 10 means. And then we have, finally, fixed choice options. So these contain a list of possible options, and respondents are instructed to either choose one or choose all that apply by ticking, for example, or selecting. All right, so questionnaires come with obviously a number of strengths and limitations. One of their main strengths over for example, observations or over experimental techniques is that they're really cost effective. So with questionnaires, we can typically gather large amounts of data really, really quickly, because once we've constructed the questionnaire, we can distribute it to a huge amount of people who can all respond almost simultaneously. So this is the case with online questionnaires. This can be the case with mail-outs, for example. And so in terms of constructing a piece of research where we want to gather large amounts of data, it's really, really effective. And it's also cheap because it doesn't need to be completed with the researcher present. Unlike an observation where we need typically 2 observers, or unlike an experiment where we need some sort of experimenter to gather the DV, here we can send it out and it can be completed in the respondents' own homes. So all of this makes it a really cost-effective way of measuring attitudes and thoughts. The data is generally really straightforward and easy to analyse. This is obviously more so the case when we're using closed questions, because this lends itself really well to inferential or statistical testing. So we can see whether there are any differences, for example, between males and females by counting the frequency of their responses. Or we can measure the strength of attitudes really easily by quantifying how many people strongly agree or strongly disagree with a particular statement. Not only can we do statistical testing, but it's really easy to represent as descriptive data. So we can represent this in the form of sort of graphs or tables, and we can calculate typically medians and modes. We're unlikely to really use the mean when we're analysing data from a questionnaire, but we'll talk about that another time. All right, in terms of limitations, obviously in a self-report technique, we're relying on the respondents to be truthful, and this is obviously not always the case. Some people may not have a perfect memory for events. Some people might not have fully formed thoughts or attitudes. Of course, we've got the issues of typically retrospective data. So if they're having to answer questions about what's happened in the last week or month or year, then people may not be able to recall accurately. But what is even more likely is that there are particular demand characteristics that may be present. In particular, this idea of social desirability bias, or you can think of it as faking good. So this is where respondents lie because they want to present themselves in the best possible light. So for example, a questionnaire that asks, how frequently do you lie? Well, participants are likely to underestimate or respond with a lower frequency than what is actually true, because they want to make themselves look good. And this doesn't necessarily mean that they're trying to be intentionally deceitful, but it's just human nature to want to present yourself in the best possible light. Obviously, in a questionnaire, this if it's anonymous, which they should be, then perhaps this is less likely to happen in the case of, for example, an interview, where you're face-to-face with your interviewer, where social desirability bias is even more likely. But it is still present, and particularly when questionnaires are asking about sensitive information, then people may not answer in a truthful way. Questionnaires can also produce response bias, which is where respondents tend to reply in a similar way. So for example, always ticking yes to the questions, or always answering the same end of the rating scale. So for instance, always selecting 5 out of 5. Just because of habit, once they tick yes to a couple of questions, or once they select 5, they tend to do so for the rest of the questionnaire, even if this doesn't actually represent their true attitudes. What we can also have is a particular form of response bias called acquiescence bias, and this is where participants agree with the items regardless of the content of the question. So they will just say, yep, true, strongly agree, even if they don't actually think that. And we'll talk about this more in reference to a particular questionnaire known as the F scale. Okay, so how do you actually then construct a fair questionnaire that's likely to gather reliable and truthful data from your participants? Well, before constructing your questionnaire, you need to make sure you're really, really clear on the aims. Once you've got a clear aim in mind, then it's going to make it much, much easier to write appropriate questions. We need to make sure that the questionnaire is short and really to the point. We don't want to waste participants' time. We want to give them an indication of how long it's going to take before they begin. And this is why often when you're doing online questionnaires, it will tell you what page you are on. You're on page 4 out of 5, or you're 60% complete. And the questions themselves should be short and shouldn't be rambling too much. What we can do to assess the validity of our questionnaire is to assess the concurrent validity. So concurrent validity is it involves comparing your new test or your newly constructed questionnaire with a previously established and valid questionnaire to see if they produce similar results. So if you give your questionnaire to participants and gather their data and analyse it, and also give them a previously established and valid questionnaire and gather their data and analyse it, what we should see is that there is a positive correlation between responses. So we should find if your questionnaire is valid and is assessing the same topic as a previously established questionnaire, we should see consistency in participants' responses. If the data gathered from our questionnaire is wildly different from expected based on previous research, then we've got to really question the validity of our questionnaire. So we'll talk further about concurrent validity in later lessons. The questions themselves need to be concise, unambiguous, pretty neutral, and easily understood. So here I'd like you to refer to the dodgy questionnaire that you looked at in class. The problems with something like this, I seldom feel blue. Well, you've got a couple of words there that could be a bit ambiguous. What does seldom really mean? How frequently are we talking? And what does blue mean? Is it just a little bit down? Is it really sad? Is it depressed? And so it might not be clear to participants here exactly what's being asked, and therefore we might not get an accurate response from them. Fox hunting is barbaric and any sane person would want it banned. Here we've got an example of strongly emotive language that's likely to lead participants to a particular response. So this could also be seen as a slightly leading question. And then here, I am not unhappy in my job. This double negative is confusing. And this is going to lead participants to perhaps answer incorrectly because they didn't truly understand the question and not because they believed or didn't believe in that item. So in order to ensure that our questionnaire is valid and is going to correct and is going to collect accurate data from our participants, we're likely to conduct a pilot study. So we're likely to administer our questionnaire to a small set of participants. We're going to ask them for their feedback, and then we're going to gather their data, and we're going to identify any issues with either the wording or the length of the questionnaire, and then we'll make any necessary changes before administering the questionnaire on a wider scale. So this is obviously to be more cost-effective and efficient. We want to determine the measurement scales in advance. So we're going to decide whether we're going to have Likert scales or fixed choice options. We want to make sure that our labels are accurate as well. So we want to know in advance what 0 is going to be, what 5 is going to be, for example. And we're probably likely to use a combination of different measurement scales as well as other open questions. Now, this is a really interesting point here, and this is one that we're going to look at when we look at questionnaires in the future, is this idea of reverse scored items and lie scales. So reversed score items are items that are sort of scored in opposite directions or in reverse directions. So you can see some examples here. I am unhappy, yes or no. I am unhappy, yes or no. These two answers cannot both be answered positive, for example, yes and yes, and can't both be answered negative, no and no. If a participant does answer in that way, you know they're lying. They can't be unhappy and also happy at the same time. They can't answer yes to both of those questions. And so what researchers will frequently do is put in what are called a lie scale. So they're typically like truthfulness indicators that are built into some questionnaires. And their only purpose is to determine whether participants are lying or not. So sometimes these are completely irrelevant items in the questionnaire that aren't actually assessing the same attitudes as the rest of the questions, but they're there to determine whether people are telling the truth or not. So immediately you know if a participant has answered yes to both items, that they're lying somewhere. What we can do is also reverse score items. So for instance, you could have a question, I will do well in my exams. 0 could be not very likely, and 5 could be very likely. So the question is, I will do well on my exams. And then you could have a reverse scored item. So later on in the questionnaire, you have a question that says, I will do poorly on my exams. So this is a question that is written in the opposite direction. And here you have opposite scoring. So here you would very likely becomes a 0, and not very likely becomes a 5. So you can have them scored, written in opposite directions and then scored in opposite directions as well. And this just prevents participants from lying, or at least you can determine when they are lying. To assess the face validity, you might give this to some peers, you might give this to other professionals in the field, or you might give this to participants as part of a pilot study. And you're going to ask them, do the questions look like what they claim to measure? Or perhaps you might give the questionnaire to these people and ask them, what do you think these items are assessing? And if what they say is consistent with your aims, then you can determine that it's got face validity. So basically this is asking, on the face of it, does this look like it is measuring what it intends to measure? So this is just a really easy way, a pretty crude way, but an easy way nonetheless to check for validity of your questionnaire. And then we need to consider the reliability of it as well. And we can do this through 2 methods. Now, we're going to be looking at all of these later on in the course, but they're particularly relevant for questionnaires. The split half technique is a reliability technique. It's a method used to check measuring instruments like a questionnaire, where we basically divide the questionnaire in half. And we give participants the first half of the questionnaire to complete, and then we give them the second half of the questionnaire to complete. And this is testing the internal reliability, because what we're trying to determine is whether there is consistency here between their responses on the first half and their responses on a second half. So for example, we might give them an IQ test or something, a questionnaire to measure their IQ, and we should see that they get the same score in the first half as the second half. If not, then our items need to be reassessed and rewritten, because there is an internal consistency between those items. So therefore, our reliability is going to be questioned. For the test-retest technique, this is where we give our participants the same test on 2 different occasions. And then we assess, excuse me, whether there's a correlation between the 2 sets of results. So there we go. Sorry, excuse me. So we assess them on time 1, and then with the gap in between, we assess them on time 2. And again, we just want to make sure that there is a positive correlation of 0.8 between time 1 and time 2. So that's it. That's how we construct a questionnaire. We'll look more at self-reports when we look at interviews in a few weeks' time.